Okay, folks, nice to see you all. If we could make our way toward a table, grab our coffee and our snacks. We'll start in a minute. Or two. Well, good morning, Chris. How are you, buddy?
Good.
You made it.
Yeah,
Good. Okay. We will open with a prayer, and then I'll tell you how we're going to proceed for this Bible study. Lord God, Heavenly Father, on this festival of Epiphany, we thank you that in your grace and goodness you have shined the light of Jesus Christ into our hearts. You have worked in us, and you continue to work through us, and for that we are most grateful. And as we devote our study to the life of Christ over the next 6 weeks, we ask that you would strengthen our faith and bring us into an even closer relationship with him than we already have. Be with us, guide us, help us to learn and grow for Jesus' sake. Amen. Okay. This Bible study is entitled Knowing Jesus Better. It's a topical study of the life of Christ. And with the handout, the blue handout, and it looks like they may be gone. They are gone. So if you see some folks who are coming in, if you could just, and if you're willing to share, to pass along to someone who might not have one. Terrific. Just some introductory thoughts. And I would just call your attention to the quote from Martin Luther there. It is because of his humanity in his incarnation that Christ becomes sweet to us, and through him, God becomes sweet to us. Let us therefore begin to ascend step by step from Christ's crying in his swaddling clothes up to his passion. Then we shall easily know God. And again, the intent of this course, the title of this course is Knowing Jesus, who we all know, but knowing Jesus better. And we're going to do it in a topical study. And let me make sure we've got this. This is the way we're going to approach this Bible study. Week number 1 is today. And that is, we're going to be looking at the land that Jesus lived in. Then we're going to be moving to week number 2, the claims Jesus made about himself. Number 3, week number 3, we're going to take a look at the miracles that Jesus performed. Week 4, the people that surrounded Jesus. You know, we talk about Pharisees and Sadducees and so forth. Week 5, we'll be looking at the parables that Jesus told. And week number 6, the great events that define the Christian faith, because all those great events revolve around Jesus Christ. So today we begin by looking at the land that Jesus lived in. And some of you may know this, others of you may not, but my wife and I were privileged to be on a trip to the Holy Land. We got back just this past Thursday. We had left on December 27th and returned this past Thursday. So 8 days in the Holy Land. If you have ever been to the Holy Land, or if you ever will be to the Holy Land, and especially if you're involved in one of these tours, about the only way I can describe it is sensory overload. There is so much to see, and especially if you're involved in a tour, it's kind of like trying to see, 14 national parks in 12 days. You're just kind of moving from place to place, and there are so many different places that you could spend so much time at, but it's kind of moving along so that you can get to the next place. Plus, you're doing it with 40 to 50,000 of your closest friends. Pilgrimages. People on pilgrimages, and so there's always these big lines, and your guide is rushing you from place to place so that you can see these sacred sites. However, it just so happens that this is the first of our topics, the land that Jesus lived in. So I'll be interspersing perhaps some of my personal observations of being in the Holy Land. If you look at the handout, we begin with the big picture, the world at Jesus' birth, and we got two references there, Luke chapter 2, verse 1, Acts 2, 5 through 11. I'm going to just tell you what these are, because otherwise I don't think we're going to have enough time. But if you want to go over this, you can look at these different references, and these aren't all the references that could have been chosen. But Luke chapter 2, verse 1, that one we know, in those days there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. Well, this was the Roman Empire, 44 BCE to 117 CE. Are we familiar with those terms, BCE and CE? It used to be just what? It used to be BC and AD. But now, within the last few decades, it's become 44 BCE. Before CE stands for the Common Era. And so BCE is before the Common Era, which is essentially AD. And then the Common Era is what we used to call AD, or at least in scholarly pursuits they call it CE.
And now it's before COVID and after COVID.
Before COVID and after COVID, yeah, there we go. So here's the Roman Empire, and the other reference I've got down here is Acts 2, 5 through 11. You remember that? That's the account of Pentecost, and how we've got people from all over the world, who have come to this area, God-fearing Jews from all over the world, and you can, Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, etc., etc. So this is what the world looked like at the time of Christ, and we, of course, are going to be focusing on this area here. What were the major divisions? This would be just another example of the Roman Empire as far as what was under their subjugation, and then client states, we'll be talking about that, was under their jurisdiction, and they controlled Judea, etc. We'll be talking about that more in the hour to come. The physical map of the Holy Land and the major divisions that we hear about when we read the Gospels. We hear about Judea in the south, we hear about Galilee in the north, and Samaria in the middle, and then we call these areas, Transjordan, across the Jordan. We'll hear about the Decapolis and Perea. So those are terms as we read through the Gospels we're going to be hearing. So Galilee is the north country. Judea, just mentioned as the cosmopolitan south because of the fact that this is where Jerusalem is, which is obviously a key city in the life of Christ. Samaria is the unliked middle. And why was that? We always talk about the Good Samaritan, and when Jesus goes into Samaria, sometimes he catches some static. just a real brief bit of history that one of the world powers in the 8th century BC was the nation of Assyria. Assyria came and conquered this area, and what they did is they left some Jews behind, but the way in which Assyria did things is that once they conquered a nation, they'd bring in somebody else. They'd bring in some other subjugated nation, and they would intermarry, and therefore you've got in Samaria a group of people who did not have pure Jewish blood, and therefore there was this continual conflict between Samaritans and Jews. So Samaria is here, and in fact, sometimes when Jews had to come from Galilee to go to a pilgrimage to the Holy Land in Jerusalem, how'd they do it? The cleanest route would be going like this, right? They would often go, They would often just avoid Samaria altogether. So Samaria was the unlike middle, and then the Transjordan we talked about as being the Decapolis. Decapolis means 10 cities. We'll see those in the Gospels, and then Perea. Other things just mentioned here that are not mentioned in the Bible, but you would have certainly heard of or possibly heard of, would be like Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were, and something a little bit farther down here, you might have heard of Masada. All right. We're going to continue on with looking at 4 important cities in Jesus' life and his ministry. And we'll just call attention to this area here. This, as far as kind of a topographical map, you see that the Holy Land that Jesus lived in has all kinds of different topography. It's got fertile areas, and it's got a lot of mountains and a lot of wilderness and desert. City number 1 that we want to take a look at would be Bethlehem. Bethlehem, literally translated, Bethlehem, which means house of bread. What do we know about Bethlehem? It is 5 miles south of Jerusalem. Although if you were to go there today, there is no distinction between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. It'd be like Milwaukee and Wauwatosa. You know, it's just all filled in. But when we think of Bethlehem, at the time of Jesus, it would have been 5 or 6 miles from the city center of Jerusalem. The church of the, I'm going to go back here. The Church of the Nativity is the oldest existing Christian church in the world. I would have to say that, and again, just a little bit of history. For the first 300 years after Christ, 1st century, 2nd century, and into the 3rd century, the church was not recognized. The Christian church was not recognized up until who was the one who gave it legitimacy? Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, in the year 300, I forget, 306 or so, something like that. At that time, Christianity was recognized, and in fact it was endorsed because Constantine himself became a Christian, and then it became fashionable to become a Christian. And so Christianity was endorsed by the emperor in the early 300s, and after that is when we start seeing these churches being built. And so what would happen is that, okay, this information has been passed on down. We believe that this is the place where Christ was born, and therefore you would erect a church on top of that. So all these sacred sites have churches which were built on top of, and then down through the centuries, you had other people. When Christianity was out of vogue, then you had Persians, and you had Muslims coming and destroying the Christian churches. Then you had the Crusades, and then they would be rebuilding these churches and so forth. So it's kind of like a layer cake as far as some of these churches go, and as far as many of these sites go. But the point is that the oldest Christian church was the Church of the Nativity, which was erected over what was believed to be the site where Jesus Christ was born in Bethlehem. Constantine was great at putting up these churches. The other one he put up was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which would have been over the empty tomb of Christ. And his mother, Helena, maybe you've heard of her, she was also a devout Christian, and she put up churches at different places. But Bethlehem has got the Church of the Nativity. It's the oldest existing Christian church in the world. And if you have visions in your head about going to see the place where Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and thinking that you'll see this pastoral scene of, a manger and a wooden stable and so forth, what you're going to find is that you've got this big, ornate, and in many ways gaudy kind of church on top of some place where you go in the basement and you'll see a star in the basement, and it'll say, this is the place where Jesus was born, and this is the place where the stable in which he was, this is the stable in which he was born, which is really a cave. And it's kind of like, at least for us, because there were so many people there, it was okay, this is where Jesus was born, take your picture and move along. This is the manger, move along, because we've got all these other pilgrims behind you. Bethlehem, though, obviously was an important city in the life of Christ because this is where he was born. What do we know about Bethlehem from Scripture? Well, we've got a bunch of references here, and again, we won't be looking these up, but it is interesting. It's mentioned already in Genesis chapter 48, verse 7. Bethlehem is called Ephrath. And what does that remind you of? But thou, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though thou, you are little in the clan of Judah, and so forth. It's also the place. Another reference here, which I don't have, would be in Genesis 35, verse 19. This is the place where Jacob's wife Rachel was buried. So it's mentioned in the New Testament, or in the Old Testament, as the place where Jacob's wife Rachel was buried. 1 Samuel 17, verse 12, just tells us that this was King David's hometown, Bethlehem. Micah 5, verse 2, that's that beautiful messianic prophecy which says the Messiah is going to come from Bethlehem. Next, we've got Luke chapter 2, verse 4. We know that's from the Christmas story, and we're told that Joseph was from the house and lineage of David, so he went to the town of David. Matthew 2, verse 16, reference to where King Herod sent his soldiers, and that's the site of the slaughter of the innocents after the wise men came and reported that they were there to see the King of the Jews. Here's some pictures of modern day Bethlehem. And let's see if we've got, this would be the Church of the Nativity. And again, this is a nice picture. This is a stock picture because there's not, all kinds of people in there. Eastern Orthodox Church has pretty much claimed that. And even with these different sites, sometimes you've got Eastern Orthodox and you've got Armenian Orthodox and you've got the Christian Church, and they all share these churches, and they take turns having special events there. That would be one of the underground caves. I'm not exactly sure which. Oh yeah, that's actually a star there, and just gives you an idea of these churches. You can go down in the basement or the lower level, and that's what you will find. The next city, which is important in the life of Jesus, would be the city of Nazareth. And Nazareth is in the North Country. It comes from a Hebrew word netzer, which means shoot or sprout or branch, or that's what Bible scholars believe would be the root of the word. And because there is that one reference that you might remember that says Jesus grew up in Nazareth, and he will be called a Nazarene. And as a fulfillment of a prophecy, he will be called a Nazarene. And Bible scholars are not sure exactly what prophecy is being mentioned there, because there's nothing in the Old Testament that says that specific thing, except for the fact that in Isaiah a shoot will come from the stump of Jesse, and they think that, that perhaps is the connection that the inspired writer was referring to. So Nazareth means shoot or sprout or branch. It is 14 miles west of the Sea of Galilee. And it's not mentioned in the Old Testament. And it's a very, it was at the time of Christ a very small city. And you might even remember one which was kind of held in disrepute. Like, remember how the question was, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And it was kind of just a backwater small town. You couldn't imagine anything happening there. We've got some references, obviously a number of references to Nazareth in the New Testament. Luke 1:27 through 28 identifies it as being the site of the Annunciation, when the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary and told her that she was going to be the mother of the Christ. Well, she was in Nazareth, so that was obviously her hometown. In Luke 2:39 and 4:16, it's identified as being Jesus' hometown. Matthew 13, verse 54, Jesus refers to it as his hometown. And we also know that he was not received well there. Remember, that's when Jesus comes and he preaches in the synagogue, and he says that a prophet is not, received in his hometown, or is not accepted in his hometown, and he was rejected at Nazareth, and that's also Luke 4:16 through 29 and Matthew 13:54 to 58 are those references. And it's interesting because if you remember, after Jesus preached in the synagogue and they rejected him, remember what they did? They walked him toward the end of town, and they were about to do what? Throw him off a cliff. And it wasn't Jesus' time yet, so he walked through them. But it is interesting, and it's now, if you can visualize that, let's see if we got a picture of that. This would be the town of Nazareth today, but this is on the edge of Nazareth. And so that's where they must have walked him, and they were about to throw him off, but it wasn't Jesus' time. So Nazareth was built on this. And over here, I believe this is correct, this is probably Mount Tabor, and Mount Tabor is suggested to be the site of Jesus' transfiguration. And he went up on a mountain. I think it's also, when we talk about mountains, we think about the Rocky Mountains and so forth. The mountains there, when they talk about Mount Tabor or Mount Hermon or Mount Moriah and so forth, are really, we might consider them to be just really, really tall hills. What's the next big city in the life of Jesus as we follow him through the Gospels? It would be Capernaum. And here we see Capernaum listed here. It's on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. And what's interesting is when we went there, it was referred to as Capharnaum. It wasn't Capernaum. It's on the great highway from Damascus to Acco and Tyre. Ptolemais is another word is a different name for the city of Acco. That would be a Greek name for it. But it is Capernaum. There were only so many main highways, so this was a fairly bustling city and a lot of commerce. It was on the lake. It contains the ruins of a beautiful synagogue. We observed as well. There are all kinds of ruins in Israel, and more are being discovered. I wouldn't say on a daily basis, but there's just a lot that are being discovered. And I think the Israeli government has put in protective measures in the way in which you build. You have to be very ginger in the way in which you build, because over the years, some ruins have been broken or have not been preserved because if you just are bulldozing and so forth. But once a ruin has been identified, then all construction has to stop as you spend time trying to unearth what may have been there. And this is kind of a side note, but for example, you see this city here, Magdala. Can't really see it. Magdala is the supposed hometown of a woman named Mary. Mary of Magdala, Mary Magdalene. And really, they have an extensive site which they have uncovered, but it really wasn't uncovered until the year 2005. So again, there's just a lot going on, continuously going on. But Capernaum would be a big city in the life of Jesus. It contains the ruins of a beautiful synagogue. It is also the place, appears to be the hometown of Peter. And do you remember, shortly after Peter was called, Jesus did something for his family. Remember what he did? He healed Peter's mother-in-law. And there is a church. They believe it has been suggested that they have discovered the house of Peter, and where his mother-in-law may have been, or where this miracle may have taken place. How do they know that? I don't know that they know that for sure. It could be one that would be somewhat similar, but that is identified in Capernaum, and there is a church on top of that. Capernaum is not mentioned in the Old Testament, but obviously it's mentioned many times in the New Testament. Matthew chapter 4, verse 13 identifies it as Jesus' northern headquarters. And Jesus spent a lot of time in Capernaum. John 6, verse 59. John 6 is the feeding of the 5,000, and it also says that this was where Jesus, after that, gave his famous bread of life discourse, and that was in Capernaum, at the synagogue in Capernaum. And Matthew 11, verse 23 says that Capernaum and, you go back, Capernaum, and Chorazin and Bethsaida up here were all denounced by Jesus, because they're obviously, remember when Jesus said, if the miracles that had been, the miracles that, many miracles took place here, but you didn't believe them, or you didn't connect them to who I am. And he says, woe to you, Chorazin. So that would be on the Sea of Galilee, Capernaum. Some pictures. This would be that that synagogue that they have unearthed. And again, some of it's been reconstructed, but they would see that as being the synagogue. This is a church, a modern church, obviously, but underneath it, and it's got. Let's see if we got this. Yeah, this would be the ruins of the synagogue. That's that modern church, and underneath here, it's got a glass bottom so you can see down. That is the supposed house of Peter, where Jesus would have healed his mother-in-law. So Capernaum would be the third big city in the life of Jesus. Born in Bethlehem, didn't spend much time there, grew up in Nazareth. It's interesting with Nazareth, again, we had a very knowledgeable guide. He was a Christian, Eastern Orthodox Christian, and he said that I think the population of Jerusalem or population of Israel is about 6 million, and he says there are only about 150,000 Christians. And but he was very, 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 very knowledgeable. But when you go to Nazareth, you'll also, to no one's surprise, there's a church dedicated to Joseph, and there is set aside kind of a cave with perhaps some carpenter tools, and it is suggested that many people grew up in these kind of caves, hewn out of rock in a rocky area, so that you think of Jesus growing up in Nazareth. This was the suggestion that he possibly could have grown up in a cave, which again shatters many of our visualizations. But just passing that on. The fourth big city in the life of Christ that we need to be aware of that is obviously Jerusalem. And Jerusalem stands for peace, shalom, foundation of peace. Jerusalem now is in the southern part, the land of Judea. It's located on Mount Zion and Mount Moriah. Pastor Schrader in his sermon refers to how the people of God, the believers, are sometimes referred to as Zion. Jerusalem is sometimes referred to as Zion. Zion's got multiple ways of being understood. Mount Zion, if you've been to Jerusalem, and now that we have, you see it's got hills and valleys, some of which are built on, others which remain valleys. Mount Moriah is the supposed mountain. What would have happened on Mount Moriah? Abraham and Isaac. Okay, Mount Moriah. So also whenever, because of the fact that it's on these hills, remember how whenever we read the Gospels, whether you're coming from the north, east, south, or west, you are always going what direction to Jerusalem? You're always going up to Jerusalem for a couple of reasons. Obviously, even just because of the topography, you're going up to Jerusalem, but also spiritually, because Jerusalem is where the temple was, and that was the spiritual center of the people. It's the capital of Israel, and then of Judah. We're going way back to when, with King David and Solomon, when the kingdom of Israel was at its high point. Jerusalem was the capital. After Solomon, you may remember that the land or the nation split. The northern half became the nation of, continued to use the word the nation of Israel. The southern half was called the kingdom of Judah, and Jerusalem remained the capital of the kingdom of Judah, whereas Samaria became the capital of that northern kingdom. Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BC. The northern kingdom, which would have been from here on up, that was wiped out. In 722, when the Assyrians came, they wiped out the northern kingdom, took the 10 tribes away, and they never really came back. Jerusalem, and then largely because the people of Israel at that time when the kingdom was divided, they didn't have any godly kings. They had been warned by the prophets again and again and again that come back to God, otherwise bad things are going to happen. They didn't listen, and bad things did happen. Assyrians came, led them away. Jerusalem, or Judea, hung in there for a little longer, but in 586, they too were conquered by the Babylonians. The Babylonians led them away, and they stayed there 70 years in captivity, the Babylonian captivity. But the difference is, God said after 70 years, you're going to come back because the promises I made to you and to the world need to be fulfilled. And so that's why we have Bethlehem in the area of Judea. And that's, of course, obviously where the Savior was born. But Jerusalem, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BC. It was the site of Solomon's temple, and we're going to get to this in just a bit. Solomon's temple was this magnificent structure, one of these wonders of the world. Actually, the Roman garrison, the Roman soldiers destroyed that, and that was leveled. And when the people came back, approximately 70 years later, they restored the temple. Jerusalem was restored under Ezra and Nehemiah, and the temple was rebuilt at that time. And that sometimes you might hear about Solomon's temple is referred to as the first temple, and when the temple that was rebuilt is sometimes referred to as Zerubbabel's temple. You'll read about this in Ezra and Nehemiah. It's sometimes called the second temple. And then the temple which was at Jesus' time would have been this second temple, but it was going to be expanded. And we'll talk about that in just a bit. But Jerusalem was restored. The temple was rebuilt. But once again, Jerusalem was destroyed, and the temple was destroyed in 70 AD when Roman soldiers came in and wiped it out. Where is Jerusalem mentioned? In the Old Testament, Genesis chapter 14, verse 18, in the whole account of Melchizedek, who is called the king of Salem. So that is a reference to Jerusalem. We've got other things, 2 Samuel 5 through 9, etc. Connects Jerusalem with how David made it his capital city. And it's called the City of David because, and Mount Zion, all those terms are used, interchangeably. David made Jerusalem the capital city of the kingdom. Psalms 120 through 134 is a designation within the Psalms, and perhaps you remember that little title underneath those. Those are all called songs of ascent, and those would have been psalms which would have been sung or spoken or responsively going back and forth among pilgrims as they're making their way to Jerusalem and to the temple. For example, and you can help, it kind of helps to visualize. Psalm 121 is just a beautiful psalm, one of our favorites. How does that go? I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And you can kind of visualize as these pilgrims are making their way to Jerusalem, when the image or the silhouette of, say, the temple or the mountains of Jerusalem first come into sight, you could see them breaking into this psalm. I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord. I heard another interesting take on that psalm, and this is just, a little bit, we digress. Another take I heard on that psalm once from someone was that as the pilgrims were making their way to Jerusalem, remember in the Old Testament, in the Old Testament, when shrines to false gods and idols were put up, they were designated, they were put up in high places. Does that sound familiar? And one can kind of visualize, possibly, as pilgrims are making their way, they can see the remnants of these pagan shrines. And maybe they're saying, lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? Not there. My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. But the Song of Ascents is as pilgrims are making their way to Jerusalem and their most holy site. Luke 2:41 through 50, that we find, that's the one account of Jesus as a boy, the boy Jesus in the temple. Where do we find him? In the temple, talking with the spiritual leaders. And then John 12 through 15 is the triumphal entry. Jesus comes into Jerusalem. When you see pictures of Jerusalem, probably the most identifiable thing is, you've seen that picture before? The dome of the rock. I think it's Dome of the Rock or Dome on the Rock. That's a Muslim site, an Islam site. Again, when Islam took over the Holy Land, and then we get into the whole, Crusades and so forth. This is an observation. It's just this history of one-upsmanship, that when the Christians would take over, they'd wipe out the Muslim things and put on a Christian, church. When the Muslims then, they'd wipe out the Christian church, and it's kind of like, one-upsmanship. This is the Dome of the Rock. It's a Muslim church, temple. I'm not even sure what it's sacred site. It's the most sacred site. And the rock that they're referring to inside is supposedly the rock on which Abraham may have attempted to sacrifice his son Isaac, is what they say. Could also be the rock, they say, that from which Muhammad made his night visit. So it's a sacred site to the Muslims, but it's right smack dab in the middle of where the temple was. So Jerusalem is so interesting because you've got these three world religions which are coming together, converging on Jerusalem. You've got Islam, and you've got Judaism, and you've got Christianity, and they've all got their own sites. There's Jerusalem. You can see remnants of old Jerusalem in the walls there. I think this is a model of what Jerusalem and the temple would have looked like. That's we'll talk about that in just a bit, but that would be the temple in there, and these were the courtyards of the Gentiles. This would be a fortress was attached to that whole area, Fortress of Antonia, because they always had to have a Roman guard, because they had to be able to dispatch guards in case the Jews got out of hand, which they often did. And this would be the Wailing Wall. And there's really no significance to this wall other than the fact it was a retaining wall. But it is a retaining wall, and that is, from that period of time, from Jesus' time, the time of the first century. And that's where you find a lot of devout Jews, or most conservative Jews. You'll see them praying at the Wailing Wall. Maybe you've seen those pictures. And that's the Wailing Wall at night. And there again, you can see people worshiping or praying. Because Jerusalem is so vital to Jesus, we can identify probably, and this isn't in your notes, but we can identify 10 visits of Jesus to Jerusalem. Certainly as an infant, when he was brought for purification. And that's when the whole idea, that's when Simeon met him, and Anna. He visited the temple courts at age 12. That's Luke 2:41 through 50. That would have been, the boy Jesus in the temple. Temptation by the devil on the highest point of the temple. Remember that? When Jesus was tempted, he took him to the highest point of the temple. And he said, if God will take care of you, jump off. And that whole exchange. The cleansing of the temple at the beginning of his ministry. You remember, Jesus actually did this twice. He cleansed the temple, once at the beginning of his ministry and then once during Holy Week. The healing of the invalid at the pool of Bethsaida. Visit in the fall for the festival of tabernacles. Just going to go through these. Visit in the winter for Hanukkah. Confrontation after Lazarus is raised from the dead. Holy Week visit, spent a lot of time in Jerusalem. And then his ascension from the Mount of Olives just outside the city, 40 days after his resurrection. And of course, Jerusalem is the site of Jesus' crucifixion and his resurrection. We're going to move on to now 3 areas which were important in the life of Jesus' ministry. First is the Sea of Galilee, sometimes referred to as the Sea of Tiberias, also known as the Sea of Kinnereth or the Lake of Gennesaret. So that's all referring to the same place. Tiberias would have been, there is a town here, Tiberias, which came a little later, about 20 A.D. This was built, a Roman city, and because of that, the Romanized name for the Sea of Galilee would have been the Sea of Tiberias. It's 12.5 miles long, between 4 and 7.5 miles wide. So it's not a huge body of water, but it's a big enough body of water. How long is Lake Winnebago? What's that? About like that? Okay, yeah. Contains a great variety and abundance of fish. Nestled among mountains, and I'll show you a picture of that, which is, we've all heard this, and we had the opportunity to visualize it. It really does lay low. There are bluffs all around it, and because of that, remember how, even with seasoned fishermen, storms could come up rather quickly. The wind blows off these bluffs and falls down into the lake, and it makes it very, very turbulent. So storms do come up quickly, and we see that experienced in the life of Christ. Mark 1, verses 16 through 20. What is that reference to? That is how it's the place where Jesus called his first disciples. Peter and Andrew and James and John, the sons of Zebedee, saw them fishing along the Sea of Galilee. Matthew 8, 23 through 27, it's the place where Jesus calmed the storm on the Sea of Galilee. And John 21, it's the place where the resurrected Jesus appeared to his disciples. And there again, there would be a picture, and you can see that, you kind of got these bluffs and these hills. It kind of down, it's set low, and when the wind comes off here, it can cause turbulence very, very quickly. Obviously, it's a touristy place. There, people will take. We took a little junket on the Sea of Galilee, and that's probably about how the waves were. It kind of choppy. And again, just you can see how turbulent things can get, how quickly that can happen. A second big location in the life of Jesus is the Mount of Olives. It's a mountain ridge of the east side of Jerusalem. So we've got the Mount of Olives. Here's Jerusalem, and I'll show you a picture in just a bit. Named for the olive trees that grow on it. And they say that there is one olive tree which was still there, which, because they can live for a long, long time, obviously. They say that there is an olive tree there which is over 2,000 years old. So it is possible that there is still an olive tree which was there at the time of Christ. It's separated from Jerusalem by the Kidron Valley, and it rises about 400 feet above Jerusalem. So if you can think of Jerusalem, there's this valley, and then here's the Mount of Olives. So there's the, you can kind of visualize that. There is the Mount of Olives. Here's Jerusalem with the temple, and along on the Mount of Olives down here is going to be the Garden of Gethsemane. And this would have been the place where Jesus would have come from his triumphal entry. And it's also the place where Jesus prayed his, in the Garden of Gethsemane, prayed his prayer. Matthew 24, verse 3, it's one of the favorite gathering places of Jesus and his disciples. We'll find that Jesus went there often with his disciples because when the enemies of Christ were looking for help to identify Jesus and find out where he might be, they went to Judas. Judas agreed, and Judas took them where? To the Mount of Olives, because Jesus often went there. Luke 19, Jesus wept over Jerusalem. After the triumphal entry, he goes back to this area of the Mount of Olives. He gets this visual of Jerusalem, and he weeps over it. What else we got? Luke 21, verse 37, just says it's one of his favorite places. Matthew 26, it's the location of the Garden of Gethsemane. And Acts 1, verses 10 through 12, also identifies the Mount of Olives as the site of Jesus' ascension into heaven 40 days after Easter. So, there's an idea of where the Mount of Olives is in proximity to Garden of Gethsemane. Is down here. Here's that Kidron Valley. Here's the Temple Mount. And there's a gate here. Jesus would have come into that golden gate. Those are those olive trees. And this may be the one. And this is well preserved. But yeah, looks like something out of The Hobbit, doesn't it? Finally, Herod's temple. It began in 18 BC. King Herod was a vassal of Rome. He began building this temple. Actually, this was something I hadn't known, our guide insisted that King Herod didn't build the second temple or add on to it, but that the Jews came to him and said, "This has fallen into disrepair. Give us permission to pay for it and build it." And he said yes, but then he gets the credit for the one. It's called Herod's temple. It was begun in 18 BC, and it was largely done. My understanding is it took about 10 years, but it was always when you build something, it always gets 95% done, and then there's that 5% you're always working on for years and years. Well, it was completed in 65 AD as far as all the detail work. It was destroyed, didn't last real long. It was destroyed in 70 AD when the Romans came. It had 2 courts, one for the Israelites, one for the Gentiles. It is located on the summit of Mount Moriah. Obviously, we've got lots of references here. Luke 1:5 through 25, that's where the angel Gabriel appeared to Zechariah, who was working in the temple, father of John the Baptist. Luke 2:46, his boy Jesus in the temple. Mark 12, much teaching there during Holy Week in the temple. And then John 2:13 through 16, Jesus cleansing the temple. That was the first time, and the second time was during Holy Week. But here again, you can see, here's the temple, Garden of Gethsemane, is over here. Here's the Mount of Olives, and this is that Kidron Valley in between. This would be a rendition of Herod's temple, which would be called the Second Temple, maybe even the Third Temple, because so much extensive work was done on that Second Temple. But the Second Temple, and again, if you have any kind of a study Bible, you undoubtedly have pictures of Herod's temple and the different gates that are sometimes mentioned. And there again, you see the large courtyards. And those would be the three locations which are significant in knowing Jesus better, because he spent a lot of time around those areas. So I've been doing all the talking. Thoughts, questions, or comments on anything that we've talked about here today? Yes, John.
On the map, there was a dotted line that went through the Kidron Valley, and I was wondering if that is a modern border, like between countries?
I don't know. I don't know what that would have been, what that would have signified. Yes, John.
Did you happen to see where John baptized Jesus in the Jordan?
I did.
Or was
And
that
I think that the things that probably made the biggest impression on me personally were the things where you could visualize these things taking place, which were untouched. There is the Jordan River. First of all, is not a big river at all. We think of Mississippi, or it's in many places it's very it's not a big river at all. But the Jordan River, where it empties into the Dead Sea, is where and directly east of Jerusalem is where it has been suggested, and probably with good evidence, that John would have done his work.
So would that be in the Perea area?
Right here, it would have been right around here. This is Bethany east of the Jordan. I think that is mentioned in Scripture. That's around where he did it, right where it empties into the Dead Sea. Now there was, if you've been to the Holy Land, this is my understanding, there was a site, farther up that had been suggested, but this one makes much more sense. But I would say, to me, where you could visualize Jesus' ministry and where he walked would have been, say, the Jordan River, because that's not all commercialized, and the Sea of Galilee, because that is still not, there's not condos around it. It looks like it would be at that time. And then the Dead Sea down here, which has got 8 times more salt in it than any other body of water on the earth. And what's also interesting is right here, let's say that this is the site of the baptism of Jesus. Immediately following the baptism of Jesus, what happened? You remember? He was baptized, and then immediately he went into the wilderness, remember, for 40 days, where he was tempted by Satan. That is very striking, because there's a lot of wilderness there. There is miles and miles of just, it's almost like these sculpted sand dunes, but they aren't sand, they're rock, covered with dust, and it's hard to describe. It's kind of like, if you've been to Arizona, it looks kind of like that. But it's miles and miles of wilderness, and you think about Jesus being in the wilderness for 40 days. It's obviously he was divine, but that area, it's very unforgiving territory. But that I would say made an impression upon me because that is relatively untouched. And that same area around that, right in here, is if you remember from your Old Testament, when David was being pursued by King Saul in the Old Testament, and there's that, he went to the wilderness of En-Gedi, and that's where, David was he was in the cave, and Saul was using the bathroom, and he cut off a piece of his robe, and then after Saul left, he said, David said, I could have had you if I wanted. And that cave or that area of En-Gedi, again, it's just very, very forbidding territory. Those people really had to be in good shape. So I would say the spot which is identified as the place where Jesus would have been baptized is probably maybe not the exact spot, would have been in that locale. Other thoughts or questions or comments? All right. Well, thank you very much. Till next week, we are going to talk about the claims that Jesus made about himself as we continue our quest to know Jesus better. We'll close with the blessing. Lord, bless us and keep us. Lord, make your face shine upon us and be gracious to us. Lord, look with favor upon us and give us peace. Amen. Thank you.